My name's Imogen Bhogal. I'm a presenter and producer on the Fully Charged Show, a show which dedicates its content to showcasing all things going on in the automotive industry. Now, this afternoon we are in for a real treat, but why on earth are we actually here? Well, read any McKinsey, Deloitte, BCG, or any kind of consultancy report, and they will all tell you the same thing. Diverse and inclusive teams are more productive, generate higher revenue, can more easily capture new markets, have greater retention, and are more creative, and the list goes on and on. And none of that is new news to anyone here on this call. The contribution that the fantastic people in this virtual room bring to this marvellous, important, and wonderfully complex industry is blindingly obvious. And yes, there are targets and quotas and discussions about attracting pipeline talent to this sector in the first place. But once we're working, those quotas or ambitions for companies to become more inclusive and diverse don't always immediately translate into a culture that supports and enables that vision. There are challenges, conundrums, and queries for which there is rarely a handbook. And that in part is the value of this network, where we can build connections, understand how to be better advocates and allies, know what to ask for in our organisations, realise that our experiences may not be so unique, so that we can capture the toolset and best practices we can deploy to drive change in our careers, organisations, and ultimately across the industry. Not a tall order for today's agenda whatsoever. So today we have some absolutely fabulous speakers, panels, workshops, and networking opportunities. And I know you are in for a really, really wonderful and inspiring next few hours. But to kick us off, we are joined by a truly inspiring person. Penny Weatherup is People Director at Volkswagen Group UK, where she has spent over 16 years. She will be taking us on a journey through her career, from her first foray into understanding customers at a hotel to a seat on the board at VW and sharing the nuggets and lessons learned along the way. Please join me in welcoming to the virtual stage, Penny.
Thank you, Imogen. That's a lovely welcome. Thank you.
Oh, no problem at all. I am just going to take a moment to put my phone on airplane mode, which is 100% what I should have done before. There we go. So we have so many things to cover, and we had, I had the fortunateness to be able to catch up with you a few weeks ago, where we went through some of these stories, and I'm so desperate to share that with the audience here. So let's get into it. Now I want you to take us back to your very first steps into the world of work as possible, because somewhat unusually for the automotive industry, you didn't start with cars or transport. So tell us how it all began.
I didn't. So I came out of university and wasn't really sure at all about what I wanted to do it. And having worked in a number of restaurants and bars, I really loved the customer service side. So I ended up working for a brewery that was reopening a very old, what was a pub, and making it into transformed it into a small hotel. And I spent a couple of years doing that. I was in my early 20s. And in those times, the setup was quite often that if you're operating that with a partner, so it was quite often couples that were running it, and I was running it with my partner at the time, the female would not get a salary. There was a notional amount that was paid to the female, and the male was considered to be the license holder, therefore majority salary went there. So one of my first challenges in the world of work was to challenge that approach. And so I challenged it with our area manager. And even in those days, there was legislation to protect women from that kind of setup. So I knew I was on strong ground, but I had to wait for it to be raised at a board meeting, and then I got the message that yes, that was okay. So salary split 50-50. So when I look back at my career, it's quite interesting to think about what it was like then, which was late 80s, to how it would be now. And I don't think any organisation worth anything would dream of treating their employees in such a way. So that was one of the challenges I had there. But that aside, I absolutely loved working with the customer, integrated. In hospitality, there is no industry, isn't an industry, I think, that can compare about direct contact and relationship building with customers in the moment. You know, when something goes wrong, you've got to fix it there and then. And it's absolutely fabulous when it all goes to plan. And I learned a lot of my skills around organisation and planning. My mantra, 90% preparation, 10% delivery, comes from those days in hospitality. But ultimately, 2 years doing that, I just knew that wasn't going to be where I wanted to spend my career, and limited lifespan with that, and decided that I would move on.
Which is so fascinating. I mean, because thinking that a notional amount, that seems absolutely wild. And we're not talking about 1920s, we're talking about the late 80s, which is astonishing to think of the change that's happened in that time, and actually the bravery that you needed at that particular time to be able to bring up those conversations. But there you really understood your sort of love for the customer, and also, I suppose, when to kind of actually accept that this isn't for me, it's time to walk away. So you left there and you went on to a financial services company, which is quite a change. What made you pursue that route?
Yeah, so I think I had bearing in mind I was still not that long out of university, and I'd been travelling and come back and then joined the hospitality industry. I felt that I really wanted to work for an organisation that was going to invest in me, was going to invest in my development, and that I was going to develop my skill sets. So I started temping in financial services, which is a bit of a theme throughout my career. And there was a job available. There was 2 of us that applied for it, and luckily I secured the role. And it was really an administration role, but grassroots, understanding about how financial services from a life assurance and pensions perspective is sold and then administered from the beginning to the end for customers. And I'd really learned a lot doing that. And I moved from there to an office in Birmingham, and ran their office there. But I always said to my regional manager at the time, I want to progress my career and I want your job. And it's only with hindsight that I realised that I was quite pushy about it. She probably was thought, who does she think she is? But I was very clear that I wanted to progress. And that was part of my learning from working in the hospitality industry. So I think it's very clear about it's very important to be clear about what your ambition is. I wasn't really conscious about it at the time. I was coming from a place that for me was I was just saying what I felt quite naturally. Whereas I think sometimes in my later career, I could have been even clearer about that. But that was what I was doing in the early point of my career. I wanted progression. I was prepared to challenge for it. And in the end, I got that role fortuitously because the branch network grew and it was split. So I had the north of the country and my colleague had the south, but I got the progression that I was looking for.
And I suppose there is a bit of a joy when you're sort of first starting out in your career, that you're slightly uninhibited and slightly less afraid of the consequences of saying, actually, I would like your job and this is how we're going to get there. But how was that received at the time?
Actually, my manager was female, and she was probably not that much older than me. And so I think we were kind of a similar ethos around careers. And so she was really supportive, very supportive. Her boss was male, and I'm not saying it's all about gender, but I think it took a little bit of time to convince him that A, there needed to be 2 roles, and B, that I was the right person for that role. But he was convinced in the end. And I think that's another recurring theme as well, needing to convince people that you're the right person for the role. And I had a sponsor, actually. Wouldn't have called it a sponsor in those days, but my manager then, Ruth, she was my sponsor. And
so, just so I've got this correctly, that role that came up, that was your first step into the world of HR?
That was my first step into managing actually. People management, yeah. And I carried on working at, it was AXA, so in financial services. And I carried on working in their direct sales arm for quite some time. And then it became clear that my then boss, there was various mergers as there always is. My then boss wasn't going to be going anywhere, and I was still doing the same regional role that I'd been doing previously. So it really, I had to really reflect on where I wanted my career to go. And it came back really to my first thoughts when I was thinking about where I wanted to go after I'd worked in hospitality. And that was, for me, it's always been about, technically, I want to be able to be an expert. And also I wanted to develop into an area where I'd got transferable skills. And I'd worked in a people manager role for quite a long time, really enjoyed that, and decided that HR was something that I'd be really interested in. So I then started investing myself in those studies to get my HR qualification. And then I started to look for job roles in HR, which is quite a big department at AXA. And that's where I started to come up with a bit of another challenge, shall we say. But I guess my learning and my kind of advice to anybody would be always be prepared to invest in your own development, because it will get you to that next step. And the only person that can do that really is yourself. Can't rely on anybody else to do that. So I had a clear pathway as to where I wanted to go.
And so when you started looking towards HR roles within AXA, and you obviously had those qualifications to say, I'm more than capable to do this, and you had a phenomenal amount of knowledge and experience within AXA Group at that point anyway, was there any pushback? Were they like, well, look, Penny, you don't have a background in HR. There are plenty of other people that could be much better suited to the role. How did you navigate that transition?
Yes, I did get quite a bit of pushback. So before I got the role, I started my CIPD qualifications knowing that's where I wanted to go. So I was partway through my studies, and the organisation was going through a merger and the HR department was changing. And the local head office had a vacancy in HR. So I applied for the role and was discounted. So I didn't even have a conversation with anyone, despite the fact I'd probably at that time worked for AXA for at least 5 or 6 years. I didn't get any positive affirmation that maybe I would even have a chance. So I complained. So I rang the hiring manager at the time and said, I don't understand why you've not considered me for the role. Why haven't you considered me? Because I was working in the business area that I would be responsible for as an HR manager. So I knew it inside out. So I thought, well, that gives me an insight into it. And I would have sponsors in that area because, you know, it's sales and people like, you know, it works on kind of your relationships to a degree. And I've got pre-existing relationships. Anyway, he refused. He was a really lovely guy, but he didn't see the point that I was raising. So then, obviously, they got an internal job board, and then I noticed some months later that they'd got 2 vacancies, and they obviously hadn't filled the first one. So I went straight back in again and said, right, you've got 2 vacancies now. I reapplied, and they interviewed me, and I probably didn't do the best interview. Okay, I didn't come from an HR technical background, and they asked me a couple of questions that I thought, oh God, I didn't even think about that beforehand. But I got the job. And 6 months later, my boss then said to me, Penny, I don't know what we would do without you. So, you know, affirmation, if there was any needed, that was the right thing to do. So again, when I'm navigating my career, unconsciously, but on reflection now, I can see that I have challenged where I needed to and probably made myself a bit of a pain to people and made them feel a bit uncomfortable about the decisions they had or hadn't taken. But I was very persistent on that. So at least I was consistent, if you like, persistent and consistent in the way I was doing it. And I think sometimes you just need to be bold and quite brave about what you're doing, because ultimately you don't have anything to lose. You really don't.
And I can see sort of some themes emerging here and things that you started to build upon. I think previously it was about being clear about that ambition. And then once you're clear, it allows you or affords you that ability to be brave and bold, perhaps as well, because you've got that, you know where you want to go. You can take that leap. But I think it's also interesting that actually you did a lot of legwork there and made it very as if you were the obvious choice. for your stakeholder in that situation. I think that also speaks to your love of the customer and kind of a customer-centric approach as well. But you left that role in 2003. So what made you realise that you were ready for a new opportunity?
I've been with that organisation for 11 years, and my career does have a pattern of relatively long service, but with two organisations in particular, and the location wasn't working for me versus where I lived. And although I'd been through an assessment centre and had good feedback from that, I wasn't passionate about moving into one of the more senior roles there. So when I knew that, I knew then I needed to look for something different, and I'd been looking, but for on this occasion, I was approached about a role that was local to where I lived in a different industry. Again, it was a private practice law firm, and it was to set up their HR department. It was a greenfield site, so I was very conscious that I was coming from a corporate background. So when I went into the interview there, a private equity law firm is very different to a corporate organisation. So when you're spending their money or when you're sitting in front of them, they are the owners of the business. So it's a very different dynamic. It had some real, so there were some challenges around that in terms of how I would manage my stakeholders, but equally, it was their money to spend. And so they were able to make, and I was able to make decisions without some of the constraints that you have working in a corporate world. And that was quite liberating. And because of that, when they value you, they really value you. So I started on a certain salary, and I think probably within about 12 months, I'd had pretty hefty salary increase, which was a real demonstration for me of the appreciation of what I was adding, but also showed me that you don't always have to work in the corporate world. There are different routes to progress your career and keep things really interesting. That was a greenfield site, and I learned a lot there. It was a real learning opportunity for me. And it also helped me shape my thinking about what I was prepared to do on a personal level. So prior to that, I'd always done roles that required a fair amount of travel, quite a lot of driving. And I learned I didn't want to do that anymore. So I think as you progress your career, there are decisions that you make that are also aligning with your personal circumstances and your wants, really. And I think that's really important, because I think sometimes you can perhaps over-index on the career versus actually what makes you happy and balanced. So I definitely learned that from working there.
It's really interesting as well, because I think many people will be able to empathise this with working in the automotive industry, where service time can be really, really long, actually, and it's typical to meet people who worked in automotive organisations for 40, even 50 years. And actually being able to have that moment, and obviously it wasn't automotive for you, it was with AXA, to be able to say, I don't want that role. I don't want to sort of climb this particular corporate ladder. I think that's, again, nice to be able to kind of take that moment of reflection and realise you can step off the treadmill or the sort of travelator heading in a particular direction. And again, I think interesting that squaring personal ambitions with what happens in the workplace. And we were talking about the amount of travel before we joined this call, and it's something that I know in my own personal career we have extensive debates about at home. So you're not still there. You're not still at that private equity law firm. You moved on. So again, what was the moment that you realised this isn't for me? And was it perhaps that travel?
Yeah, I mean, I think really I felt my job was probably done after about 3 years there, but I ended up being there for 4. But carrying on the thought train of personal life and balance, I met my future husband, and that then became a decision for me in terms of I was no longer, living in Birmingham wasn't really the best thing for our relationship. So I moved back to an area that I grew up in. So that again was quite a significant shift for me. I'd never been in that position before, where I was making a decision about my career based on my personal circumstances. So I did relocate, and I took about 3 months off. I was really lucky to do that. So I had time to settle back into life around Northampton and Milton Keynes. And I'd done some, I was already doing some study. I got qualification in MBTI, if you know that psychological assessment tool. And I'd invested in that myself. And I was thinking about going in and doing some coaching and maybe working for myself. But as a backup, always a backup, I'd registered with an agency. My partner and I, we'd gone on holiday, and in Greece, I took a call from this agency, and they said, would you be interested in considering a role in the HR team at Volkswagen Group UK? I said, yeah, why wouldn't I be? I didn't know that they were based in Milton Keynes. Never thought about automotive as an area to progress my career. And they said, well, just so that you know, it is a fixed term contract for 6 months. It's working 4 days a week. And it's an HR manager role. So I said, yeah, okay, I'll give that a go. Anyway, got the job. And I guess I threw myself into it because part of my ambition actually had been to move back into the corporate world, having spent 4 years outside of it. Because when you work in an area of technical expertise, you sometimes, if you don't have access to other people, your world can become a bit in that arena. Your world can become a bit smaller. So you need that for your networking. So I did things like I joined the CIPD when I relocated and did work for them and ran some events for them. So I was kind of getting myself out there, stretching myself a bit, and at the same time was taking on this new role. So took on this new role and loved it. So really got into the operational side of the business, worked hard to understand what the business was about, made my connections. Quite quickly, I was asked to take on a particular business area. And then there was the uncertainty about, well, will I get the opportunity to become a permanent employee or not? And my fixed term contract got extended, but with the right noises about, well, we'd really like you to stay and join with us permanently. We just need always a headcount challenge and costs and things like that. And in the end, I did get offered a full-time role as a HR business partner. And the rest was history a little bit in terms of where the next steps for me went. But that was my way of joining Volkswagen Group. And I've always said that sometimes you need to take a bit of a risk, and actually taking a temporary opportunity or something that in a different industry opens up so many different doors. And to be quite confident about the fact that whether that role works out or you may end up taking another role, the experience that you get really adds to your kind of portfolio of skills, but also develops you at the same time. And so one of the things I say to people about my career generally is I've done some of those things. I've taken temporary roles. I've invested in my own development at my own cost from time to time to grow. And I've taken a few risks along the way as well. So my career path hasn't always been a dead straight line. You know, it's kind of gone a bit zigzaggy, particularly with different industries that I've worked in. And also don't always necessarily get the ideal role that you're looking for at that time, but it comes.
On a personal level at home, we sometimes talk about careers, and that if you think of a really good series that you absolutely love, take Game of Thrones, for example, not every single episode can be an 8.8 out of 10 IMDb episode. Sometimes you need the ones that get you to be able to tell the full story. And I think it's really interesting that in retrospect, obviously it appears that all of the different bits of the jigsaw puzzle came together and set you on a perfect trajectory. But it was a risk, albeit a calculated one. How did it feel at the time?
I don't think I really recognised that it was that much of a risk. I suppose I had a good degree of confidence. Well, this is 6 months' work. I'm going to get a salary, you know. So I'm working in the automotive industry. Very fortunate because we get to experience and drive the vehicles, our product. So that was a huge benefit for me. It's lovely. Even though I wasn't a massive car fan, it didn't matter, because what was lovely coming from working in two industries that were didn't have a tangible project. Having a tangible product to look and feel, it creates a different form of excitement. So I think my partner, my husband, was probably more nervous about it than I was.
Did you have any professional mentors or allies at the time that you were having these sorts of debates and conversations with in charting this next route?
Do you know, it's a really interesting question. It made me think, I don't think I did really. Not that I really recognised. I had a friendship group who I talked to, who I would bounce things around with, but probably didn't have what we would now call as an allies or sponsors, because I'd moved location and I was going into a completely different industry. I think what did happen was I proved myself to certain stakeholders in the organisation who, by the time I was coming near to the end of my fixed term contract, were then saying to my boss and my boss's boss, we'd really like to keep Penny. So once you start getting that sponsorship internally, that's where you get the benefit, I think. Definitely.
And so one of the things I'm curious to know is that you spent 16 years at Volkswagen Group, and you've had a number of different roles within that time. And I wonder how you've navigated that careful balance of your own itchy feet and thinking, it's time to move on, it's time for a new challenge, versus biding your time, really getting that experience and understanding within a particular function. How do you square those sometimes conflicting thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I think my career probably reflects that every time I've been looking to make a move and starting to look around, something has either come along or I've made it happen. And when I first took the role here at Volkswagen Group, learning about automotive was all consuming, really. It was a completely different industry. It took me 6 months to understand what after sales was. I just couldn't get it in my head for some random reason. I really don't know. And I often tell people here, don't worry, you learn as you go, you know, and asking lots and lots of questions to really understand how the business works, because it's a complex business. You know, it's very easy to say we sell great cars and parts, but it's complex. And we've got more than one brand under one umbrella. So I had to learn a lot about managing stakeholders from a group perspective versus brand perspectives. So I think I was really well occupied for the first 5 or 6 years of being in a business partner role, and I was given lots of opportunities. My boss at the time gave me lots of stretch opportunities. I then started, I think it probably became evident with my boss that actually if I didn't get a next role, then I was probably going to be looking for something elsewhere. And so a new role was created, which was head of HR operations. And this was being developed just before, I didn't know at that point, but we were about to go into quite a big piece of organisational change. So I had a really clean sheet to create, well, I got the role after applying for it and going through an assessment process. I had a fairly clean sheet to make that my own and set up my own team. And so that then really kept me engaged for the next 4 to 5 years easily, until again I got to the next point. And at that point, my boss was leaving, and who was the director at the time. And I did have sponsor and advocacy from her. I had sponsor and advocacy from our MD, and subject to going to Germany and getting some sign off, going through some processes there, I was then appointed into the role that I have currently, which is the people director. So I guess what I'm saying with that is I was comfortable to a point with things moving organically, but I would confess to suddenly being, I don't know what I'm going to do next. And then just at that point, something came along that I could consider. And I really loved this business and didn't want to leave. That was a difference as well. I was less prepared to leave this business. It's a great place to work. Love the people that I work with. So that was something that probably held me more than maybe the other organisations I'd worked for.
And it's interesting because I think at that point where you think, ready for a new challenge, actually suddenly some kind of bandwidth appears where you can start to sort of create that energy to kind of figure out what that might be, either within the organization or outside. But over those 16 years, I mean, the automotive industry generally has completely and utterly transformed, not least from an electrification perspective, but how much more sophisticated our software is, device on wheels, all that good stuff. But also from a cultural perspective and certainly a diversity perspective as well. How have you navigated that particular path, and how have you tried to implement cultural shifts now that you are in the position that you are?
Yeah, well, I think our organisation in the automotive sector generally is in a very different place obviously to where it was when I joined. You know, even up to 5 years ago, we were still selling cars, less time than that, but we're selling cars and vans and parts in a way that was done as being traditionally done. My experience in my early career here was that it was male dominated, certainly at a senior level. There was quite a low level of general diversity, whether that's, you know, ethnic diversity, disability, socioeconomic, really not even in our vocabulary or our narrative. And it took until about 2016, when I first moved into the people director role, for us to start having conscious conversations about diversity, and in particular gender diversity. But before I move on to that a bit more, my experience was, I have to confess that sometimes being in the sales and marketing and the automotive sector, and being a female, quite often being the only female in the room, and in a group function role, as it were, so not in a sales driven brand focused role, I never felt unwelcome. I was always welcomed. I think it was hard sometimes has been historically hard to get my voice heard. I think you have to work hard to do that, particularly when you're in a minority function, if you like, as well. And I think some of the behaviours years ago, and kind of the male, perhaps sometimes slightly testosterone-fueled behaviours, were much more evident then as well. And I think I found my own way of navigating through that. I didn't compromise myself. You know, the worst thing I think you can do is try to be like the others in the room, because you need to be more like them. But equally, that's quite hard when you're, for instance, talking about things that might be perceived as a softer topic, like cultural change, the need for diversity. So in 2016, we set up our first employee network group, which is called Driven Women, with a focused target on increasing female leadership up to 30%. And we recently got to that figure, just over that figure. And across our total organisation, we have 47% female representation, which is just fantastic. But it's taken time, and it's hard work to do that, and it requires a constant lens of looking through everything that you do from a diverse perspective. And it requires energy and recognition that you can't do that overnight. So it can be extremely frustrating when you come up against still some of the old points of view and a lack of acceptance as to why diversity is important in any organisation. So I think for me, it's been quite a long journey to get to where we are, but we've really broken through starting to break through some of the ceilings, but also break through some of the behaviours and ways of doing things that have constrained us, I think, in terms of our diversity, and certainly moving into a different world now in terms of our operational focus. It's made us realise that even more that we need that diversity. So we've been on a transformation journey, and we talk about our strategy, our culture, and the two things equal in transformation. So as a board, we worked on what we believed our culture needed to move from and to, did that. And then we've launched 4 cultural pillars within the organisation. And from that, we've embedded that with manager conferences, people-led conferences, and really tried to upskill our managers in terms of what we mean by inclusive leadership. And we just recently ran one session as part of a bigger day on a people leadership conference, which was all around inclusive leadership, which introduced all of our people managers to that concept and why it's important. And we still have work to do, but that's very, very absolutely embedded in our culture across the organisation, or embedded as a aspiration. We're not totally there yet, but we're doing so much stuff to ensure that that happens. And certainly all of the board and our senior leaders have really bought into why diversity is important. Through times of change, you need different ways of thinking. You need different backgrounds, different experiences to really get the full richness of everything that can add up to a successful organisation. And that's very much where we're coming from now. And if I compare that to 16 years ago, that was very different.
Well, that was going to be my question, that, you know, cultural change doesn't happen overnight and it's not words on a page, it's a critical part of strategy. And it sounds like in order to embed that actually the senior stakeholder buy-in was absolutely core to the success of that strategy.
Yes, completely. So as a board, we started in 2021 articulating the vision that we had. We engaged with some of our employees and got their feedback on our thinking. It took us absolutely ages to land on the culture statements because we didn't engage with an external supplier to help us with that in terms of creating our statements. So it was done from the heart, so we could genuinely talk to them as a group. We then rolled that out with our senior leadership teams, got their buy-in, got some of their feedback. And then the most important thing is to make sure that what we're asking of our organisation to be culturally actually then feeds through all of our processes, particularly our people processes, our competencies, alignment with that we're talking about culture as part of performance, and that we talk about culture in the way we do things around here. So it's you can talk it, you can walk it, but you've got to do it. And the do bit means that you're doing everything. And almost as a leader, you have to think about every interaction you have with every individual and think about the shadow that you cast and how that can impact positively or negatively, but particularly when we're talking about including people. So it's a very different way of thinking and then maybe sometimes acting as part of an inclusive organisation.
I've furiously been scribbling notes that I'm totally going to steal in my own place of work, but realising the shadow that you can cast, it's a really powerful way to think about it, and it's the do bit that's so critically important to embed all of the things that sit above it. I could carry on this conversation for about 4 hours, but I do want to come to at least one of the questions that we've had in the comments. So what's your next role on the horizon?
That's a really good question. Yeah, so I've been doing this role for nearly 7 years now. There's still plenty to keep me occupied here because we're transforming and everything is so exciting. It's all about change and I thrive on that. So no plans to proactively seek anything outside of the organisation in terms of my next role. Being a global organisation, I could have taken up global opportunities in the past, but again, you know, my personal situation was I didn't really particularly want to be parted from my husband, and he works for himself, so he's not geographically mobile. So I think it's probably continuing to see and work with the change that is happening in automotive and specifically Volkswagen Group UK. That's my next step, if you like. I think if I was ever to think about another role, I'd think very carefully about what I wanted to do, the time that I'd need to invest. I'd think about my working pattern. I definitely wouldn't be working full time. I'd love to be able to be balancing it with something different. And I guess it's probably the first time in my career that I'm at that juncture. You know, it comes with age, sad to say, but it also gives you a bit of freedom to think differently about how you might just want to live your life more generally, and perhaps how work fits into that rather than the other way around.
And my final question, and I realised that I should have warned you that I'm going to ask this one, but If you could whisper in the ear of your 30-year-old self, so yourself who's been working for a number of years, what would be the thing that you would say to your 30-year-old self?
I'd say be confident. Be confident in who you are. And one word I haven't mentioned in this is believe in your own authenticity. So only in the latter years of my career have I become more aware about how important it is, particularly as a leader, to be authentic and be yourself. And it's okay to be yourself. My style is very, very different to my colleagues. I'm very informal. They're much more formal in their thinking style, you know. But realizing that and allowing myself the freedom to be myself, I think I'm much happier for it. And I would hope that organisations, again, if they've got, if part of the ambition is to be inclusive, I would hope that that's much easier for anyone on this call who's perhaps at the earlier stages of their career to think about being that. Don't compromise.
I think that is a lovely note to end on.